Okay, today we're going to start on the evolution unit, and this first part of the evolution unit is on mechanisms of evolution, specifically natural selection. So I've got a little video here for you all to watch on your own. Now, when you're talking about evolution, there are a lot of different scientists that you could be talking about, but the main one that we'll talk about is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin is sometimes called the father of evolution, but actually his contribution to this idea that all species have to be able to change as time goes along to adapt to changes in the environment. He's actually the person who came up with an idea of how that change occurs, and that's called natural selection, sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest. And I just kind of put this crazy picture here of this star-nosed mole. So when you kind of think about crazy things and why they are the way they are, you can kind of look at this guy. So when we talk about evolution, we're going to be talking about characteristics that make the organism successful in its environment, meaning that it lives and it lives to reproduce, and its offspring will also live. And those traits or characteristics that make this organism successful in its environment are called adaptations. And when you're talking about being successful in your environment, living and reproducing, that's referred to as fitness. So when you look at this little mole rat, you can start to look at its body and think about what must its environment be like in order for it to have the adaptations that it does. So we can see its big creepy claws. Um, Here's its nose. Don't really see eyes, so it's kind of blind. So you can think about what would be the advantage of having a nose like this. What would be an advantage of having claws like that? And I've got another video for you to watch on your own that I just found about this um, star-nosed mole rat about how fast it eats. So you can look at that on your own. But again, be thinking about why these traits that it has, why they would make this particular type of mole successful in its environment. Now, when we're talking about Charles Darwin, we are going to talk about natural selection or survival of the fittest. And a lot of people already know that he studied different types of plants and animals in the Galapagos Islands. And a lot of people know that he worked with finches and tortoises, but he also worked with pigeons. So one of the things that he termed is a phrase or a term called artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is very different from natural selection, and artificial selection is man deciding which traits and characteristics are beneficial. Um, Charles Darwin did this with pigeons. So through selective breeding, he was able to come up with different types of pigeons originating from this first type of pigeon. So this is selective breeding. So this is what people do when they breed dogs, they breed cats, horses, pigs. But this is artificial. So it has nothing to do with natural selection, which would be about environmental pressures, the climate, predator-prey situations, food sources, things like that. Now here would be an example that I mentioned before about dog breeding. So starting with this ancestor of dogs and then breeding based upon desired traits and characteristics is how we have the different breeds of dogs. Same thing can work with vegetation. So starting with this ancestor plant and then ending up with the variations that come from breeding what, or in this case, be pollinating what you would prefer to have, the characteristics that the human would find desirable. Now, what I have for you here is just a little work, just a little practice to see what you can do with interpreting this graph. So we're interpreting line graphs. Scientists use mice to study whether exercise ability can improve in animals over several generations. In this experiment, mice were artificially selected for increased wheel running behavior. The mice that were able to do the most wheel running were selected to breed the next generation. The control group represents generations of mice that were allowed to breed randomly. Okay, so looking at our graph, on our x-axis, we have different generations of mice, the first generation to the ninth generation. On our y-axis, excuse me, it shows the number of revolutions the mice ran on the wheel per day. The solid blue line here is our control group. So this is the group that can breed randomly. And then on the dotted line, this is our selective breeding group. This is our artificial selection in process here. So this is our dotted line represents the generations that were bred based upon their running ability. Excuse me. So then your questions are, what is the difference in results between the mice in the control group, your blue line, and the mice in the experimental group, your orange line? And number two, predictions. Use the trend in the data to make a general prediction about the number of revolutions on the wheel per day for mice in generation 10 of the experimental group. So it stopped at 9. What would you expect if we continued on with the orange line with a generation 10? Okay, answers. So number one, the mice in the experimental group show an increase in wheel running ability. And the mice in the control group didn't. And it kind of makes sense because this experimental group was created based upon selective breeding. So they only bred those that were good wheel runners. And in the other group, it was whatever. Number two, the trend, if we allowed this these mice, these wheel runners, to continue on to another generation, then we would probably expect their numbers to go higher because we're only breeding the best wheel runners.